I was lying in bed, minding my own business, when my phone buzzed. At first, I thought it was a spam call, but when I glanced at the screen, my stomach dropped. It was my mother. We hadn't spoken in months, maybe even a year. There was no, "Hey, how have you been?" or "I miss you." No. She skipped right over all that and got straight to the point. "I need $2,000 for Sarah's dorm costs." I blinked at the phone. "Wait, what?" "Your stepsister," she clarified, as if I had somehow forgotten. "She needs a private dorm room. A roommate would be too stressful for her." I sat up, suddenly wide awake. The audacity. "You're calling me after all this time to ask for money?" I asked, barely keeping the irritation out of my voice. "We're family," she said, like that somehow excused everything. "You have a good job now, and Sarah needs help. It's only fair." Fair. That word made my blood boil. Like it had been fair when she drained my college savings without a second thought. Like it had been fair when she acted like I didn't exist, the moment she remarried. For context, my mom married Mark when I was 16. He had 2 kids of his own, Sarah, who was 14, and Jake, who was 17. From the second they entered the picture, my mother treated them like royalty. Meanwhile, I became an afterthought. Then, when I turned 18, she pulled the ultimate betrayal. She stole my savings. A total of $24,000, money my grandparents had gifted me, money I had worked for. Gone. And when I confronted her about it, she didn't even look guilty. "You were being ungrateful," she had said. That money was needed for the family. The family she meant was Mark and his kids. Definitely not me. That was the day I packed my bags and moved in with my grandparents. And now, years later, after barely speaking to me, she had the nerve to call and demand money for Sarah? "No," I said flatly. There was a pause. "Excuse me? No, I'm not giving you money. You're being selfish," she snapped. "Sarah deserves a good college experience. And I deserved to not have my future stolen," I shot back. "Figure it out without me." I ended the call before she could try to guilt-trip me further, and immediately blocked her number. My hands were shaking, but for the first time in years I felt free. At least, I thought I was. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. A few days passed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had truly taken control of my life. Locking my mother felt like cutting away a weight I didn't even realize I was still carrying. But, of course, peace never lasts when it comes to people like her. I was stretched out on my couch, halfway through a movie, when my phone buzzed again. Another number I didn't recognize. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hello? Wow, so you really blocked your own mother?" The voice on the other end was sharp, condescending. I recognized it immediately. "Mark," I exhaled slowly. "What do you want?" He scoffed. "You think you're so grown up now, huh? Too good to help your family? Your mother is devastated." I nearly laughed at the idea. She wasn't devastated when she stole my college money. "You were living off your grandparents like some spoiled brat," he snapped. "You should be grateful anyone took you in." The sheer arrogance left me momentarily speechless. It was incredible how he managed to twist reality to make himself the victim. "Are you seriously trying to guilt me?" "This isn't about guilt," he said, his tone shifting into something more authoritative, like he thought he could talk down to me. "It's about responsibility. You're an adult. You should be stepping up and helping your family, instead of acting like some selfish..." I hung up before he could finish. 2 calls in less than a week. I should have known they wouldn't give up that easily. That night, I got another text, this time from an aunt I hadn't spoken to in ages. "Hey, sweetie, your mom told me what happened. I really think you should talk to her. She's heartbroken. Family is important." I didn't even respond. They could all act like I was the villain here, but I knew the truth. Still, the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Part of me hated that I even felt guilty at all. Years of emotional manipulation will do that to you. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, reminding myself why I left in the first place. Then, as if the universe wanted to test my resolve, my mother showed up in person. I had just gotten home from work when I saw her standing outside my apartment building. My stomach sank. She hadn't even told me she was coming. How did she even know where I lived? I hesitated before stepping closer. She noticed me immediately, crossing her arms like she was the one who had been wronged. "We need to talk," I sighed. "No, we really don't." She moved forward, blocking my path. "You're being ridiculous." I stared at her, wondering how she managed to say that with a straight face. I'm ridiculous? You stole my money, ignored me for years, and only showed up when you needed something. She rolled her eyes. Oh, please. That was so long ago. You need to let go of the past. That nearly made me laugh. Let go of the past? You mean let go of my money? Let go of the fact that you treated me like a stranger? Her expression darkened. You always play the victim. That hit a nerve. My fingers curled into fists at my sides. I'm not playing anything. I just finally learned to say no. She sighed dramatically, like I was exhausting her. You don't understand. Sarah needs this. No, what Sarah needs is parents who can afford to support her. That's not my job. Her face twisted in anger. You are so selfish. After everything I've done for you, I cut her off. You mean everything you took from me? She flinched, but recovered quickly. I raised you. I put a roof over your head. That's not nothing. You were my mother. That was your responsibility, not a favor I owe you for. She clenched her jaw, and for a moment, I thought she was going to yell. Instead, she took a deep breath, her expression shifting into something eerily calm. You'll regret this, she said, voice low. One day, you'll see how much you needed your family. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. I turned, walked past her, and went into my building, shutting the door behind me. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the lost, abandoned kid she had left behind. I felt like someone who had finally reclaimed their power, but I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. For a few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. No calls, no surprise visits, no guilt-tripping texts from relatives trying to play peacemaker. I should have felt relieved, but instead, I had that nagging feeling, the kind you get when you know a storm is brewing. And then, just as I was starting to think, maybe, just maybe, my mother had finally given up, my phone rang again. Another unknown number. I hesitated before answering, but the second I heard the voice on the other end, I clenched my jaw. So, I heard you've been disrespecting your mother. Mark. Of course. I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. Not giving her money isn't disrespect. He let out a sarcastic laugh. You think this is about money? That's literally all she called me for. This is about family, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. You've abandoned your mother. You've abandoned Sarah. And for what? Some grudge you should have let go of years ago? I rubbed my temple. Mark, I don't owe you or her anything. There was a pause, and then his tone turned cold. You're selfish. After everything we did for you, you turn your back on us. That was it. That was the last straw. I let out a sharp laugh, pure disbelief, fueling my words. Everything you did for me? Mark, you ignored me. My mother stole from me. You let her. And now that I've built a life without you, suddenly I'm abandoning the family? He scoffed. You're acting like a child. No, I'm acting like someone who finally learned to say no. Another pause. Then his voice dropped lower. This isn't over. I hung up. The second I did, my hands were shaking not from fear but from anger. The sheer entitlement was staggering. They had spent years pretending I didn't exist, and now they wanted me to be their personal ATM. I blocked the number. Again. And yet, the universe still wasn't done testing me. Because later that evening, I got a text from an even more unexpected person. Hey, I know things have been tense, but I really need your help. Please don't ignore me, Sarah. I stared at the message, rereading it a few times. Unlike my mother or Mark, she wasn't demanding anything outright, but the intent was the same. I don't know why you're acting like this. It's just money, and it's not like you can't afford it. That last part sent a fresh wave of anger through me. It's just money, as if it were pocket change, as if she were entitled to it simply because she existed. I deleted the message. Then, without hesitation, I blocked her too. That should have been the end of it. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Sure enough, a few days later, my mother tried one last desperate move. She sent me a letter. At first, I almost tossed it straight into the trash. But something about it made me pause. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was just the final need to confirm that I was making the right choice. I opened it, and immediately I wished I hadn't, because it wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a last-ditch attempt at guilt-tripping me. It was a legal notice. My mother was trying to take me to court. I laughed, actually laughed out loud, because it was so ridiculous, so over the top, that it almost didn't feel real. According to her, I had a familial obligation to help with Sarah's education expenses. She was trying to frame it as if I had a legal duty to step in as financial support because I was doing well. Fresh out of college, barely keeping my own bills paid, and somehow she thought I was a walking trust fund. I called my grandparents immediately. My grandfather, who had already been furious when he found out about the stolen college savings, was livid. "She's lost her damn mind," he said bluntly. "Don't worry, we'll handle this." And they did. A few calls to a lawyer friend, a few legal clarifications, and the entire case was shut down before it could even begin. It was over, or at least as over as it could ever be. Because after that, I didn't hear from my mother again. No more calls, no more texts, no more guilt-tripping relatives. For the first time in my life, I was truly free, and it felt damn good. Weeks passed. For the first time in years, I felt like I had complete control over my life. No unexpected calls, no guilt-tripping messages, no manufactured family drama, just silence. It should have been peaceful. But peace doesn't come easy when you've spent years waiting for the next fight. Some nights, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd hear from them again. I knew better than to think they'd changed. People like my mother and Mark don't just give up. They wait, lurking in the shadows, planning their next move. I kept my guard up. Then, just when I started to think maybe, just maybe they'd finally let it go, it happened. I came home from work one evening to find someone waiting outside my building. My stomach sank the second I saw her. Sarah. She was leaning against the entrance, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. When she saw me, she pushed off the wall and took a step forward. "We need to talk." I didn't even stop walking. "No, we don't." She moved to block my path. "Please." I sighed, glancing around. People were coming and going, and the last thing I wanted was to have an argument in front of my neighbors. 5 minutes, I said. "That's all you get." She exhaled in relief, like she'd just won something, and for a brief second, I almost felt bad. Almost. "I don't get it," she started. "Why are you acting like we're strangers?" I let out a sharp laugh. "Because we are strangers, Sarah." She flinched but recovered quickly. "That's not fair. I didn't do anything to you." I leveled her with a look. "You benefited from everything taken from me." She opened her mouth, then shut it, like she wasn't sure what to say. I shook my head. "You were there when Mom stole my money. You watched me get pushed aside, ignored, treated like I didn't matter, and you never said a word." Her jaw tightened. "It wasn't my fault." "Maybe not," I admitted, "but it sure as hell wasn't mine either. And yet, somehow, I'm the one expected to fix everything." She was silent for a moment, then sighed. "Look, I know Mom and Mark messed up, but I still don't understand why you won't just help me. It's not like you're struggling." That hit me harder than it should have. Not because she was right, I was doing okay, but because of what it confirmed. She didn't come here to make things right. She came because she still thought I owed her something. I clenched my jaw. "I don't owe you anything, Sarah." Her expression twisted with frustration. "You're really going to let me suffer over some stupid grudge?" I stared at her, feeling a strange mix of anger and exhaustion. "Suffer?" I repeated. "You're going to college. You have parents who care about you, who prioritized you over everything. And you think you're the one suffering?" She crossed her arms. "Mom said you'd be like this. Then she should have warned you not to waste your time." For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Like, maybe, just maybe, she was starting to realize this wasn't going to go her way. "I hope you don't regret this," she muttered, turning away. I didn't respond. I just walked past her, into my building, and shut the door behind me. And just like that, I knew I was finally done. No more guilt. No more second-guessing. No more hoping they'd change. I was free. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's visit became just another unpleasant memory I was determined to leave behind. I hadn't heard from my mother, Mark, or anyone else from that side of my so-called family. It should have felt like victory. Instead, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the calm before the next storm. And, as if the universe wanted to prove me right, the next storm came in the most absurd way possible. It started with a letter. At first, I thought it was just another piece of junk mail. But when I opened it, my stomach twisted. It was from my mother. Not a handwritten note. Not an apology. A legal document. She was threatening to sue me. I had to reread it twice just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The claim that I had a moral obligation. Yes, those were the actual words to provide financial support for Sarah's college expenses. I let out a short, humorless laugh. This was insanity. For a split second, I considered ignoring it. But then I remembered who I was dealing with. My mother was relentless. If she thought she could bully me into submission through legal threats, she wouldn't stop until she got what she wanted. So, I did the only thing that made sense. I called my grandfather. When I told him what was happening, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, in the calmest voice I'd ever heard him use, he said, "She's lost her damn mind." That was the last push I needed to know I was doing the right thing. He put me in contact with a lawyer, a friend of his, someone who had known my mother when she was still just his daughter and not whatever she had turned into. After looking over the document, the lawyer shook his head. "This is nonsense. There's no legal basis for any of this." I already knew that, but hearing it from a professional made it even more satisfying. Within a few days, we had everything handled. A formal response was sent, shutting down any possibility of her case moving forward. It wasn't even a fight, it was over before it started. But my mother wasn't one to go down quietly. A week later, she called from a new number. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. Not because I wanted to hear her out, but because I needed her to hear me. The second I picked up, she launched into a tirade. "I can't believe you're doing this. You're turning your back on your family, on your sister. She's not my sister," I cut in, my voice calm. "She's your daughter. She's Mark's daughter. She's not my responsibility." "You ungrateful little," I laughed. Actually laughed. "You tried to sue me, Mom. You stole from me. And you still think I owe you something?" She hesitated. Just for a second. "I did what I had to do. And so am I." Silence. Then, in a voice dripping with venom, she spat, "You'll regret this one day." I didn't even bother responding. I just hung up. And then I blocked her. For the last time. This time, it felt different. This time, it felt final. Because it was. I wasn't looking over my shoulder anymore, waiting for the next attack. I wasn't worried about what scheme they'd come up with next. I was done. And for the first time in my life, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I had won. In the days that followed, the weight on my chest finally lifted. No more calls, no more letters, no more threats disguised as guilt trips. For the first time in years, I felt free. It was strange at first. I had spent so long preparing for the next fight, the next demand, the next manipulative stunt. Now that it was over, part of me didn't know what to do with the silence. But then something incredible happened. I started living, really living. Without the constant stress of my mother and Mark looming over me, I began focusing on things that actually mattered: my career, my friendships, my own peace. I found myself laughing more, sleeping better, waking up without that familiar dread hanging over me. And, most importantly, I stopped feeling guilty. For years, I had carried this invisible chain around my neck, forged from every "you're selfish and you abandoned us" they had thrown my way. I had spent so much time wondering if I was wrong, if I was cruel, if I was the heartless one for walking away. But now, standing on the other side of it all, I saw the truth. I hadn't abandoned my family. I had escaped them. And there was a difference. One afternoon, my grandfather called. "How are you feeling, kid?" I leaned back in my chair, watching the sun filter through my window. "Lighter," I admitted. "Like I can finally breathe." He chuckled. "Good. You did the right thing." "I know," I said. And for the first time, I truly believed it. A few months later, I heard through the grapevine that Sarah had ended up sharing a regular dorm room like everyone else. And shockingly, she survived. No grand disaster. No tragic suffering. Just a normal college experience. Exactly like I had told my mother from the start. I had to laugh at the irony of it all. Mark, my mother, and the rest of their side of the family faded into the background. Maybe they finally realized I wasn't coming back. Maybe they found a new target. Either way, I didn't care. They had no power over me anymore. One day, I found an old photo buried in a stack of papers. It was from when I was younger, before Mark, before everything changed. It was me and my mom at a park, laughing at something I couldn't remember. Back then, I had loved her more than anything. I had believed in her, trusted her. That version of her didn't exist anymore. Maybe she never had, and that was okay, because I existed, and I was finally free. Story 2. My entire world fell apart when my dad passed away when I was 15. It seemed like everything stable in my life was gone when I lost him. My father was the one who saved invoices from a decade ago in case he needed them later. He was the type of person who meticulously prepared for everything. When he was gone, I discovered that he had established his will years in advance and had been quite precise. His estate was characterized as immaculate because he wanted to ensure that I would always be taken care of. But soon after he left, home altered drastically. We were at his funeral one day when she started talking about a new person she had met before I could really comprehend the sadness. My mother didn't waste any time in moving on. This feels hurried, I recall thinking. Ken, a stranger, moved into our home shortly after, and I was still getting used to my dad's passing. I thought I had blinked, and it felt so weird. Then this man appeared in our living room, behaving as if he had been there all along. Ken. He was all right at start, I guess. Even still, having him in our home among Dad's possessions didn't feel right. My dad's equipment was lined up in the garage, and his chair was still by the fireplace, despite his favorite coffee cup being in the kitchen. It was all a silent reminder that he was still a part of the family. One by one, the reminders began to fade when Ken entered. "We have to create space for Ken's belongings," Mom would remark. I would also question why there is such a rush. Ken is also hardly contributing to the rent. It was painful to watch her remove my dad from our lives. It was like a blow to the face as every part of him disappeared. A few months after Dad passed away, I received a call from his attorney asking me to come in. I remember that day quite clearly. I felt like things were going well for the first time in a long time. My dad gave me everything, the lawyer explained, encompassing every cash and item of real estate. Everything. I was surprised there was nothing left for my mom. Since they were no longer married, it made legal sense. But this was not what I had expected. Being a young child suddenly in control of assets and real estate was hard. Nevertheless, it felt like my father was still watching over me from a distance. Mom became angry when she found out. By being positive and saying things like, "Oh, your dad really loved you, didn't he?" She attempted to conceal it. I could see it in her eyes, though. She was not happy. Presumably, she anticipated receiving something, but Dad's will had been so securely sealed that there was no room for disputes. At first, she made an effort to be kind, complimenting me and acting as if she was happy for me. However, her true objectives soon became apparent. She began to imply, as if it were my choice, that it would be beneficial to divide the bequest. Nevertheless, every time she brought it up, it seemed more like coercion than advice. One day, she even asked me directly if I would sell her one of the houses, saying it would help Ken feel more safe and included in the family. Stunned, I wondered if she could actually be asking this question. In order to make her new partner feel at home here, she was requesting that I give up a portion of his inheritance. I'm still grieving and getting used to life without Dad. I couldn't touch anything till I was 21 according to Dad's will. I informed her that even if I wanted to, I couldn't. Her expression will never be forgotten. I could see she was angry despite her attempts to hide it. At intervals, she would inquire whether I would compromise, but I would have remained firm, reminding her that the will was unalterable. I secretly knew that I would not have given her a house even if I could have. To please Ken, I wasn't prepared to throw everything away. My father used that inheritance to provide for me and to secure my future. Next were Ken's 18-year-old son and his 19-year-old daughters. To make them comfortable, Mom bent over backward. I guess they were all right, but it was obvious that she treated them differently than she did me. When I asked to go, Mom would suggest that I spend time with my grandparents instead, and she would plan their trips. She never explicitly told me that I couldn't come, even though it was clear that she wanted me gone. I therefore spent the most of my weekends at my grandparents' place. They were amazing, and I really enjoyed them. However, each time I found out about a new excursion, they had left me behind. It reminded me that my mother was establishing a new life, one that did not include me. In retrospect, I think my dad suspected something similar may happen. If not, why would he give me everything while leaving her with nothing? Maybe he saw where things were going and wanted to make sure I would be okay without him. In any event, I was grateful. However, attempting to live with my mother's new family also led to a lot of conflict between us. Clinging to what my father had left me, I found myself in the middle. For a while, I kept to myself in an effort to keep the peace. However, Ken started acting like the head of the household. He gave me attitude and told me what I could and could not do as he settled into our home. And so things began to shift. Not his home. I wasn't going to let a stranger control me since this was mine. By the time I was 17, things with Ken had gone from awkward to downright tense. I tried to stay out of his way, but he took over the area. Even so, I was aware that this belonged to my father. As if he actually had power over the area, he was here, organizing his things and telling me what I could and could not do about it. Nor did he vary in any subtle way. He would say things like, "It's time you learned some discipline," or "You need to show more respect around here." I would often ask myself, who does this person think he is whenever he spoke to me? Not only was he not my father, but he was also not going to inherit the home the way he had planned. I didn't overlook it. Every time he attempted to lay down the law, I would remind him whose house it was. Just to annoy him, I would call him Chief. And wow, it worked out great. Even if it didn't make sense, I was satisfied that he was disturbed by the term. I would respond, "Sure thing, Chief," or whatever you say, "Chief," if he started becoming demanding. Then, things quickly got out of hand. He would remark something like, "Oh, you two just need to get used to each other," or "Ken's only trying to help you grow up," while I would throw something back in these quiet standoffs. Despite my mother's constant attempts to mediate the conflict, I was aware of what was happening. He wasn't attempting to be helpful. This was about control. Ken wanted to be in charge, therefore I was going to give him that authority. Then my mom started to help him more and more. When I disrespected him, she would become angry and tell me, "You have to understand that Ken is now a member of our family," as if everyone would have agreed. She has to be informed that this is not Dad's house. She refused to pay attention. He cannot simply walk in here and act as like he owns the business. Instead, she would suggest that I make a greater effort to equal him. Finally, one day, everything exploded. All week long, Ken had been berating me for not doing my share around the home, acting as if I were simply scrounging about my own home. I'd had enough. The directness of my information caused his cheeks to flush. "You're not my father. Furthermore, this is not your home." He appeared about to explode, but my mother stepped in before it could happen. "Why do you fight with him all the time?" she inquired. "As much as I started all of this, why can't you just be respectful to him? Why ought I to?" I resisted. He doesn't respect me, and clearly doesn't respect that this was Dad's house, so that argument was the final straw. My mother stood there, tired and agitated, as Ken ran off. Finally, she looked up at me and said something that made my stomach flip. She said, "This isn't working." Then, unable to fight like that any longer, she dropped the bomb. "You should find another place to stay for a while, in my opinion." What I was hearing was unbelievable. I just waited for her to take it back, or acknowledge that she was just upset and didn't mean it. But she never did. "I believe you need some space to relax," she said, right in the eye. "My home?" I asked, barely believing it. "I'm being kicked out of my own home by you?" Her face softened as she let out a breath, but the pain persisted. "It's not just your house. We live here. This should also make Ken and his kids feel comfortable." A wave of pain and bitterness washed over me. She was, without doubt. "I know it's a lie, but choose them over me," she said. "For your own benefit, I'm doing this so you can relax and gain perspective. It wasn't about me. Calm down." She was trying to maintain harmony with her new family. She thought that without me, everything would be fine for them. Too angry to think clearly. Uncertain of what to do, I walked out of the room and slammed the door behind me. My part-time job at the age of 17 barely covered my rent, let alone pocket money. And right now, I was meant to simply go. Luckily, my grandfather intervened. Even when my mom wasn't there, they had always been at my side. They volunteered me a place to stay when they found out, and I clung to that offer like a lifeline. That evening, my grandfather arrived to fetch me up. I recall simply, numbly staring out the car window as though my universe had collapsed all over. Once more. It was relief to move into my grandparents' house. They never made me feel as if a burden, particularly my grandfather, made extra effort to make me welcome. "You're always home here, kiddo," he added, giving me a backstroke. "Don't allow anyone make you think otherwise." I needed to hear that. After everything with my mom, knowing someone still had my back made sense. Mom would still visit sometimes, though, behaving as though everything was good. She might say, "You know I adore you, right? I'm just trying to keep the peace." She seemed to be trying to comfort herself about what she had done. She tried to pass it off as normal, once bringing a box of my old stuff over and saying, "I thought you'd want these here." I saw right through it. She would give me this speech about how she was doing, what was best for everyone, how Ken and his children needed room to feel at home. and how one day I would understand. Every time she visited, though, within, I thought she was rationalizing her own decisions. I nodded along as if it were meant to make up for kicking me out. She would say, "You'll always have a place with us when you're ready." At conclusion, each visit, not wanting to tell her it was Ken's house instead of mine. It took all in me. I quit interacting with her visits. Eventually, though, I would be kind. I would not let her apologies influence me. I immersed myself into my grandparents, friends, and school, who during that period came to be my actual family. Having my grandma around helped me start to heal, even though I still felt sad and angry. She was my rock, always saying, "You're going to be okay." I came to see over time that my mother was never going to be the parent I required her to be. She was overly preoccupied with her newlywed life, with Ken and his children. I was simply a memory of a life she had left behind. I so started leaving her behind as well. If she could choose Ken over me, I reasoned, I could choose to concentrate on myself. I knew I had ample support, that of my grandparents. Though it took some time, I began to develop trust in myself and learn to stand on 2 feet. I was obliged. I discovered that occasionally the people meant to look after you won't, and that you had to stay on despite pain. I realized it was time to start truly research the assets my dad left behind. When I eventually graduated from high school and began considering college, living with my grandparents, I constantly reminded myself that these were my onward directions. They were my dad's means of guaranteeing my future, and I wouldn't let it be wasted. Of course, one of those features was the house Mom and Ken were currently residing in. If I choose to rent it, it was a strong property in a good neighborhood, ideal for that. So it was time to start planning. High school behind me and college just ahead. Why not remodel it? I pondered. That would help with education and bring in some more money. At last, I could put what Dad left behind to work building something for myself. That meant, nevertheless, a difficult chat with my mother. She would have to learn that I intended to remodel and that they would have to decide what to do next. Though I had to do it, I did not expect it happening without a hitch. I reasoned that perhaps she would understand if I addressed it appropriately. When I was at last ready to have that chat, I showed up at the house occupied by my mother and Ken. The notion was basic. I would let her know I intended to renovate and offer them a reasonable length of time to determine what they wanted to do going ahead. I reasoned that perhaps she might comprehend if I treated it gently. After all, she was still my mother. Hence, part of me hoped she would realize where I was coming from, even if I wanted things to remain nice. The strain had risen. That idea, unfortunately, did not get very far. When I knocked on the door, none replied. Their car was not in the driveway. The home was completely silent. Perhaps they are merely out running errands. I thus waited some time, assuming they would return quickly. I tried contacting her cell, left a voicemail, and even texted her stating I'd stopped by and wanted to chat. When it became evident she wouldn't be returning anytime soon, nothing has changed. My grandma casually said later that night that she had heard they were on vacation in Florida. After relaxing here, I'm prepared to have a grown-up conversation regarding my property. They are taking a holiday at the beach. A heads up would have been fantastic, but people do need a break. I waited a few more days in the hopes that she would reply to me again. Nowhere yet. She appeared to think that avoiding me would make things more difficult. I needed to stay ahead, but if she kept avoiding me for too long, there wasn't much I could do. I decided to take matters into my own hands by waiting. I was the legal owner of the house. Since my name was on the deed and I paid property taxes on it annually, I had the power to take control of the situation. It may sound a bit drastic, but I decided to change the locks. It seemed like the only way I could be honest at the moment. I couldn't let them use the flat as a free holiday home while I started the renovation, as I was getting everything organized. In order to change the locks and make sure I had all the keys, I called a locksmith. While I was there, I glanced about the home. It may seem weird to be back in my hometown, but it seemed more like a stranger's home with tidbits of my mother's and Ken's lives scattered throughout. It liked home after that. Seeing things this way inspired me to stick to my plan even more. The next day, my phone began to blare. When my mom came back, she finally discovered that they were not permitted within her irate voicemails, and several missed calls, each one more furious than the previous. How could you be so cruel to us? In one message, she yelled, "This is quite impolite." However, I was aware that she would take offense. It was worse than I could have imagined to hear her so furious. I finally answered when she phoned again. Before I could even say hi, she began shouting, "You locked us out of the house, but why?" She was adamant. I took a big breath, attempting to be calm. "Mom, for days, I've been attempting to contact you. I wanted to talk about my preparations, but she disagreed." She continued to yell, "You can't just throw us out like this." There was nowhere else for us to go. Since I had been more than patient, I claimed that I had every right to reclaim the house. I told her, "I attempted to let you know that I was intending to refurbish, but she wasn't interested." She added, her voice trembling, "I still call this place home. I can't have it taken away from me." I saw that her reasoning was nonsensical. She believed she was deserving, not about what, in her opinion, was right or fair. She needed to find another within 2 weeks, a place to call home. I told her I just had to stay ahead. I wasn't trying to be mean. I could give you no more than 2 weeks. After a long and awful silence, she finally said. She spoke quietly and coolly. That felt like a kick to the stomach. However, I was aware that I would never be able to move on if I turned around now. "You never imagined taking care of your own mother. This has to do with me taking accountability for myself, even if it required making tough choices. I'm hoping for some tranquility." Early the next morning, I hurried over to start preparing for the renovations, but Ken and my mother were already there, ready to fight. Ken appeared to be attempting to frighten me as I pulled into the driveway as he got closer. "You believe you can simply dismiss us in this manner? You have no right," he said. I didn't wince. "I do, in fact." My voice remained calm as I responded. "This was never your home, and it isn't now. It's my responsibility to pay for it. As a result, I make the decisions." He was angry, but he was unable to deny it. She broke down in tears, accusing me of unfairly abandoning them to the streets. She even mentioned how you were acting like your dad, but not in a positive manner. It hurt, but I'm still calm. "You have 2 weeks to locate another place," you tell her. Reason was my goal. All she did was shake her head. Her cheeks were wet with tears. She said, "I have to start the renovations, but I'm giving you time to sort things out." I'm amazed at how frigid you are. Ken stood there trying to appear tough, but it was clear to me that he realized he had no real say in the matter. It was difficult to see my mother in such distress, and I began to feel bad. But I also knew that if I allowed them to stay, they would never leave. What was rightfully mine was not going to slip through my fingers. This was my opportunity to retract it. As they drove away, I felt a strange mixture of relief and agony. I knew I had made the right decision, but it didn't matter. I started the first step and drove back to her grandparents' house that evening, feeling the weight of it all. No matter how challenging it got, I had to finish it. I was hoping that things might calm down over the course of the next few days. I thought they would be angry at first, but then they would start packing and change their minds. However, nothing is ever quite that simple. My mother decided to make everything as spectacular as she could, rather than deal with it quietly. One day, I went back to the house to measure the improvements. I had a contractor coming in a few weeks, so I needed everything ready. The sound of the rear gate opening. I was in the backyard using a notepad to make notes about what needed to be done. I turned around and saw my mom running in like she was on a mission. She was enraged. Her face swelled and flushed. "How could you be so cruel to us?" she shouted before I could respond. There was nowhere else we could go. "What conduct do you expect from us?" I took a long breath to steady myself. "I gave you 2 weeks, Mom." None of it reached her ears. "I won't simply evict you without warning." She continued to point out her enormous sacrifices for me and to criticize my self-centered actions. It hurt to hear her say that. She appeared to be trying to make me feel bad for desiring privacy. "Take a step back. After that, it can arrive." He entered with the same strong man demeanor, as if he thought that by just looking at me, he could alter my perspective. "You believe that because you possess this area, you can just intimidate us?" She gave a smirk. The idea of us establishing a life here made me giggle. "No, Ken. Here, I made my home and began a life." That statement didn't sit well with him, and I could see he was about to lose it. To calm him down, though, my mother placed a palm on his chest. It was my father's home. Then, sobbing, she turned to face me and begged for more time. At that moment, Ken's 19-year-old daughter came out onto the porch, holding her stomach tightly. There was nowhere else for us to go. I hadn't seen her until she got outside, but she appeared upset and was defensively gripping her stomach. At that, my mom screamed, "She is expecting a child. This is not how you should treat her. You can't kick us out right before she gives birth." That was a huge kick in the gut. None of that was what I expected. For a minute, I stood silent. They appeared to be trying to persuade me to back off by dragging every card they had. Yes, I did feel bad for her. Pregnancy is not easy, and she was young. At the same time, though, I understood that I couldn't allow it to affect my decision. "Look, this is still my house, and I'm sad she's going through this," I said, taking a long breath. "You have 2 weeks to go." Ken merely stared at me, ready to explode, as my mother began to cry. "I'm not requesting that you go today." I began to feel that being there was no longer acceptable. I told them that I had made up my mind to have this place returned. 2 weeks later, I went to check in. I could still hear my mother accusing me of being selfish and heartless as I left. However, I knew that if I stayed, I would begin to doubt myself, and I couldn't afford to do that. I focused on the remodeling timetable when I went back to visit my grandparents. I went over the paperwork, collected my notes, and made an effort to think clearly. It was challenging to let go of the guilt, although not particularly with relatives. No one desires to be the villain. However, I reminded myself that this was precisely what I needed to do. The days that followed weren't good. My phone was constantly buzzing with calls and messages from my mother's side of the family. After word got out, it seemed like everyone had an opinion about what I was doing. They were behaving as though I was only dumping her for amusement, as if I had a say in the issue, which just made matters worse. Most were blunt, accusing me of being callous or selfish for evicting my own mother, while some were nuanced, suggesting that I should be more empathetic. I attempted to block the calls and messages, but they continued. A lengthy, guilt-tripping email about my mom being caught in the middle and my need to be compassionate was even sent by one of my aunts. They persisted and made me feel guilty. My skin crawled under that one. Since my mother had chosen them over me, I wanted to ask her how she could be in the midst. I was hesitant, but arguing would only make things worse. It wouldn't do anything. Instead, I remained silent. If they were so worried about my mother, they should provide a place for her to stay. It made more sense to just blame me and stay out of it personally, because none of them was doing anything. Luckily, my grandma saw how anxious I was getting and decided to sit down one evening. She took my hand and whispered, "Listen, you did what you had to do. Don't let their guilt make you think you're mistaken. There's a reason your dad left this house." Her remarks were helpful in a way. Even though the calls and texts continued to come in, it was consoling to know she was on my side. The saddest part was realizing how easily relatives can turn against you if their wants are not addressed. I felt like everyone was trying to make me seem like the worst person alive by banding together. Over the next week, I got to work planning the improvements. I met with a contractor, went over the blueprints, and made a plan. The more purposefully I focused on what I was doing, the better I felt. I knew in my heart that this was what my father wanted. He gave me these belongings so that I could build a future for myself, and I wasn't going to let anyone take them away, not even my mom. By the conclusion of that first week, the guilt was starting to lessen. I could feel myself growing stronger and more determined. I had given them a fair amount of time, and I wasn't breaking any laws. They were responsible. If they wanted to make things harder than it should be, all I needed to do was stay focused to do this. The thought that my dad had done all of this, stood up for me, and protected my future gave me strength. When the 2 weeks were over, I felt it was time to face them again. I had been mentally preparing myself, going over what I would have to say. I had a secret wish that they would have found another place to live by now, but I knew in my heart that was too much to ask. I thought they would push back and try to make this as difficult as possible, considering the present situation. On the day I returned home, I pulled into the driveway and, sure enough, my mom, Ken, and even a few of their friends and family were huddled around as if they were preparing for battle. They appeared to be putting on a performance. I took a deep breath to assist me maintain my calm, even though my stomach dropped. They would be inspired to push me much harder if I allowed them to see me under stress. As I was getting dressed, my mother rushed up to me. Her voice was trembling and filled with agony as she began her full, passionate speech, tears streaming down her face. She broke down in tears. "It's unbelievable that you would actually harm us in this way. When I need you the most, your son is me. How could you keep your distance from me? I may have changed my mind if I hadn't spent days preparing for this. I stayed cool, though, replied and spoke intelligibly. I gave you 2 weeks, Mom. You are aware that's reasonable. I am fully entitled to reclaim this. I live here. She didn't listen and shook her head. You're acting irrationally. 2 weeks is insufficient. We are aware of the location. It was false, and I knew it. They could have found anything, or at least made some progress, if they had really looked. But they seemed to be just delaying, waiting for me to give up if I put in enough work. Then Ken came in, clearly fired, looking as if he was prepared for battle. With his jaws clenched, he said, "This is our home. You cannot simply arrive and grab it from us in this manner." I took a big breath and spoke steadily. I can, really. It is my legally. I've been more than understanding. It is now time for you to go. Anger heated Ken's cheeks, but he did not respond. He knew I was correct and had no leg to stand on. At this juncture, the family decided to step in. One of Mom's family members stepped up, pointed at me and started yelling that I was behaving like a landlord, and that family should be together, instead of a son. She went on to talk about how my mother had helped me a lot, and how I was betraying her. I took a big breath and softly told her, even though it seemed like everyone was guilt-tripping me, "I know you're attempting to assist, but you have no business doing this." I didn't let that bother me. She just chuckled and muttered something about my being cold-hearted. This is not the purpose for which my father placed me here. A quick conversation occurred to me. After that, I hoped I would feel awful enough to reconsider. They all waited for me to lose it, but I knew that if I gave in, they would never go. This would now just turn into an endless cycle of drama and excuses. "I'm not sure where we're going," my mom remarked as she started to cry even more. "We haven't saved any cash for this." I had to force myself not to say what I really thought. "Perhaps you ought to have taken it into account before letting it go on for this long." However, I was aware that would not be beneficial. Instead, I said I was sorry, but that I needed the space back. She instantly adjusted her approach. She begged me if I could give them another month, her voice shaking. "By then, I'll undoubtedly discover something," she continued, her beseeching eyes fixed on mine. For a moment, I almost stumbled, but then I remembered how often she had used the same tone, expressing optimism for an unfulfilled change. 1 month from now, I would be exactly where I was if I gave her another month. So I told her, "I could have given you more time, but I've already done so." Ken began shouting again that I was throwing them out with nowhere to go, but I just continued saying the same thing. "I live here." I keep bringing it up again and again, in the hopes that I would give in. At that point, I saw they were attempting to wear me down. From around the porch, Ken's pregnant daughter appeared, gripping her belly and looking close, almost pathetically. Her voice wavered as she pleaded, "Please, I am almost ready to have a child, and we have nowhere to go. We must have a place to live." It was hard to see her like way. One feels something when they witness a pregnant teen in terror, yelling for assistance. However, I reminded myself that I was not responsible for this. Even though it was awful, I had to focus on what would benefit me the most. I said, taking a long breath, "I apologize, but I've given it as long as I can." I turned and walked away. "I hope you find a place soon after me." With a voice full of anger and betrayal, my mother called. "I will never forgive you for this," she screamed. I persevered, though, knowing that turning around would force me to start questioning myself if I came upon her face once more. I sensed an unusual mix of humiliation and relief when I reached my car. Convincing yourself that you are doing morally is one thing, but feeling that way while everyone else says you are mistaken is quite another. Breathing is being attempted. I sat in the car for a while, trying not to let the guilt get to me too much, even though I knew they were furious and probably spoke behind my back. I had to remind myself that this was about my future too. I wasn't going to let pressure or guilt to ruin the properties. My dad had left me for a reason. Even though I knew there would be more reaction, I felt a little lighter when I finally drove away. I had taken the first step, but it was not an easy one. I had refused to back down. It was up to them now to resolve the issue. I refused to be defeated by their problems. Throughout the day, I focused on my remodeling ideas. I set up further contractor meetings, went over the plans, and got things going. It felt amazing, but I felt like I had made the correct choice, like if I was finally moving ahead in my life. I still felt the weight of all that had transpired, Nobody could corroborate otherwise, but all the commotion is for me. Over the past 2 weeks, Ken and my mother had packed up and left the house. They did not, however, leave it in silence. Right up to the last day, I got letters from family members warning me and accusing me of being heartless. Every day I would regret this one, but I had prepared myself, setting my sights on the goal of finally taking back what my father had left me and using it to do something. Their departure was as if a heavy burden had been lifted. The first time I went back to the house, after they left, it was strange. It appeared deserted and a little eerie, but it was still only my footsteps filling it. A few pieces of furniture and other random items were still there, but I also felt a wave of comfort wash over me. They weren't mixed up with things that weren't mine or anyone else's. For the first time in years, I felt like I owned the house again. The next several days were spent organizing, making space, and preparing for the renovations. We started working on the designs as soon as the contractor showed up. I felt like I was revitalizing the house with every decision I made. For example, my father was reminding me that this was his desire, that I was headed in the right direction. His presence was nearly palpable to me there. As the renovation got underway, everything started to fall into place. It seemed like a new chapter was beginning for me as the walls were painted, the old fixtures were altered, and the whole room began to change, each and every time. To inform me, my grandfather gave me a positive nod. "You did well, young one." As I progressed, the embarrassment decreased. Occasionally, my grandparents would visit to see how things were progressing. Eventually, I saw that I had nothing to be ashamed of. I had waited for my mom. I hadn't just thrown her out into the street. In the end, this was also not about hurting anyone. It was about finally living the life my father had planned for me, and about respecting his memory and aspirations. These things were left to me by him so that I could support myself and have a future. Now, I knew with a kind of surety that I had never known before. They had moved out, so one evening as I was wrapping up for the day, my mother called. She had not contacted me. A part of me questioned if I would ever hear from her again. I paused, moving my finger across the screen. Then I caught her voice, which sounded different and more relaxed. She did not accuse me of sobbing, yelling, or being heartless. "I wanted to check on you," she said. It startled me even though the question seemed simple. I replied, not quite knowing what else to say. "I'm doing all okay." She paused, and I thought for a second that she was about to say something hurtful, something to make me feel guilty. "I'm sorry things got so out of hand," she said with a sigh instead. When I heard her say that, I felt like I had everything. Even though I knew it wouldn't make things better, I hadn't anticipated an apology. I was curious as to why she would have picked Ken and his kids over me. We had all made our choices. "Finally," I answered. "All I had to do was what I needed to do." She hardly made a whisper. "That makes sense to me now." Other than a few polite phrases, we scarcely talked at all before hanging up. As I put down the phone, I experienced a strange sense of tranquility. Maybe we wouldn't be as close as we used to be, and maybe she never fully understood my choices. However, that phone call seemed like a little step forward, as if we had finally moved past the worst of it. It was a pretty house, but even once the renovations were complete, it seemed familiar in a way I hadn't expected. Knowing that it would provide a steady income to support me during college and beyond was novel and exciting. I decided to lease it. Giving the new renter the keys seemed like ending a chapter, but in a good way, because the house was once again being used for its intended purpose. For the following 3 months, I focused on my studies and started working part-time to save money for future objectives. My grandparents were there for me. Every day, their unwavering support serves as a reminder that I wasn't alone. I also gradually stopped feeling the need to justify my choices to everyone. All that mattered was that, based on my father's memories, I knew I was doing well. Over time, my mom and I remained polite but distant. She would sometimes get in touch, usually with quick updates on family news. I think that's what we both wanted. We never talked about the house or what had happened before she moved out. Implicitly, we knew that each of us was carrying on in our own way. One evening when I was sitting on my grandparents' balcony watching the sunset, my grandfather came out and sat beside me. For a while, he just stared across the horizon without saying anything. "Your dad would be proud of you," he continued, finally touching my shoulder. I was far more touched by their statements than I would have imagined. My grandpa, who had always supported me, was here to tell me that I had done my father proud. After pondering, if I had made the correct decision, and fighting remorse for a long time. I felt a sense of serenity and closure that I hadn't had in a long time. I was aware at the time that I had overcome one of the most difficult times in my life. I stared out at the last light. Maybe my mother would always think I was the one who moved the home, and she would never understand why I did what I did. But I knew in my heart that I would have honored my father's legacy and finally taken control of mine. That would be plenty. As the years went by, I remained close to my grandparents and focused on building a life for myself. I used the resilience and willpower I had gained to build a future I knew my father would have been proud of. I think I've finally come to terms with forgiving my mother as well. She had reasons, just like me. Both of us were forced to live with the choices we had made. In retrospect, I see the entire event as a turning point. I learned the hard way that sometimes protecting yourself is necessary to take control of your life, even if it's challenging and painful. But in the end, it was well worth the effort. I created my own future, preserved my father's memories, and upheld his legacy. And that's all he ever desired, in my opinion.
Story 3. When I returned from a business trip, I discovered that my wife had changed the locks. From my couch, she texted, "I found someone better." I inhaled deeply, grinned, and answered, "Are you certain about that?" Then I turned to go. She was yelling on the phone 4 days later. During our most recent video call, something didn't feel right. The throw pillows were rearranged in our living room where Vivian was seated. I nearly missed it since it was such a little element. "You've been married for 8 years and you notice these things?" She had lost the corner cushion that she always kept on her side of the couch. One I had never seen before took its place. She said she needed a change and shrugged it off when I brought it up. I was finishing off a vacation to Seattle that lasted 2 weeks. Larger project? Greater potential? When I departed, Vivian had been helpful. I should knock their socks off, they said. However, as the days passed, our talks became more hurried and her texts grew shorter. When I gave her excellent news about the project, she stopped asking how my day was going. Her answers seemed forced, phony, or just worn out from work. She would say, "It gets, I was aware that I had assisted her in starting her career from scratch. She was unaware of the true amount of money I'd put into her achievement. However, we will address it." 3 days before to my return, the first serious warning sign appeared. I could hear masculine chuckling in the background during our evening conversation. Vivian instantly responded that it was simply the TV when I questioned her about it. Although I had built a unique soundbar on our TV myself, this voice was undoubtedly that of someone. Shortly after pretending to have a headache, she hung up. At 2:00 p.m., I touched down. Thursday. I just landed an SMS and got no answer. Unusual since Vivian always responded in a few minutes. It seemed like the Uber journey home took longer than normal. I saw other information that didn't appear right. Our family plan prevented her from identifying her location, and her Instagram stories featured our living room from hitherto unexplored perspectives. I believed my key was jammed when it refused to spin in the lock. Realizing that the lock was new took a whole minute. I felt strangely at ease as I stood there with my bag still in hand. While I was abroad, my wife, with whom I had been married for 8 years, changed the locks. Her text message arrived at that moment. I found a better one. Make no attempt to enter. I've moved on. The timestamp indicated that she was typing this while seeing me from my couch in my home via our security camera. I inhaled deeply before typing. "Are you certain of that?" After that, I wheeled my bag behind me and left. No scene, no hammering on the door, no drama. As she attempted to reply, only 3 dots appeared and vanished. I called my friend Damien after checking into a neighboring motel. He had put together what I had missed in less than an hour. Vivian had been seeing a customer of her business named Ezekiel. Over the previous month, they had been seen at eateries. This is where things become fascinating, though. In the past, Ezekiel has dated married women in roles similar to Vivian's. Always. While Damien was speaking, they were about to make significant professional decisions. I went to our shared cloud storage and logged in. Tech was not Vivian's forte. The passwords I had created were never altered by her. They were there, 3-week-old pictures of them together in our home. But in her haste to replace me, she had overlooked something important. Once more, my phone buzzed. "You're handling this better than I thought you would, Vivian. Don't fight for us." I suppose my decision to locate someone better was correct. As I considered the paper I had just discovered on our cloud storage, I grinned. She had forgotten about a paper from last year when I had assisted her in establishing her financial portfolio. I gave my lawyer a screenshot that I had taken. "Let me have 4 days," I responded to the SMS. "After that, we'll see who discovered anything superior," she responded right away. What is the intended meaning of that? I didn't respond. Rather, I turned on my laptop and started writing an email to some former coworkers. I got all I needed before midnight to let her know precisely what she was losing. I'll begin moving things along tomorrow. As Vivian attempts to find out what I know, I'm enjoying the continual buzz of my phone for the time being. The finest aspect? She is unaware of the roots upon which the cozy life she currently enjoys, which she shares with him on my couch, was established. She's going to break. For now, let her enjoy her superior decision. She will discover in 4 days that some choices have unanticipated repercussions. First of all, I want to update you and thank you for your support of my last article. I was able to focus thanks to your remarks. These are the events of the past 24 hours. The agreement Vivian signed when I assisted her in establishing her investment portfolio is the one I mentioned discovering. She overlooked the fact that I assisted her with more than simply investing. The majority of the capital came from me. The agreement made it quite clear that some interests would have to be sold right away if we split up. However, that was not the cause of her worry. Sophia, Vivian's sister, contacted me last night. She was in tears. "Hunter, I can no longer be silent. Ezekiel, this is the 3rd time he has done this. He preys on women like Vivian, takes advantage of their connections, and then vanishes after achieving his goals." Although I was previously aware of Ezekiel's pattern, Sophia provided information that I was unaware of. 2 months ago, she supplied screenshots of Vivian and Ezekiel's talks. Their romance was not the only thing they were planned. Using the details I had given Vivian about the next projects my firm was working on, they were talking about business prospects. According to Sophia, there's more. Vivian requested me to keep a few documents for her last week, claimed that it was only backup copies of work-related materials. Today, I had a look at them. Hunter. She has been transferring funds, large quantities. Sophia, I believe, hung up, into our shared accounts. It was there. Vivian had been buying expensive things under false pretenses, such as a new automobile, expensive furnishings, artwork, or even household expenditures, all purchased during the past month and concealed under several transactions. The intriguing aspect? Although she had made the down payment using our joint account, her business expense account was utilized to finance the major items. I had assisted her in creating the identical account years prior. I was still identified as a financial advisor on that one. It was time to show her just how much she was risking. I sent a text message. I just had a fascinating conversation with the board on those cost reports, especially the ones from the previous month. The couch looks fantastic. Original receipts would be useful, by the way. She responded in a matter of seconds. "What are you discussing?" "Oh, and it was really instructive to learn about Ezekiel's past with Mills and Carson. 2 years and 3 settlements. It's impressive." The typing indicator then came and went many times. "Hunter, we must speak." "Yes, we will." "Tomorrow," following the conclusion of my ethics committee meeting. Her subsequent message revealed genuine panic. "Which meeting?" "Let's talk about this, Hunter." I didn't answer. Instead, I wrote an email to the board outlining my concerns regarding specific financial issues and sent images from Sophia to my lawyer. Just insurance. I haven't sent it yet. Damien brought a USB drive and takeout to the motel. "I found something you won't believe." Pulling up files on his laptop, he said. It turns out that Ezekiel had been recording more than just his pillow discussion with Vivian. Thorough conversations on customer information, future projects, and anything else. "She is being used by him," Damien shook his head in agreement. "And she is so engrossed in it that she is unable to anticipate what will happen." The buzzing on my phone persisted. Vivian was now bargaining instead of panicking. "You know you're mistaken regardless of what you believe. I can describe anything. Don't be hurried, please." I was interested in the final message. "None of this has to be communicated to the board. We can work something out." I sent my last SMS of the evening with a smile. Spend 10 minutes checking your email. Pay close attention to the March 15th attachment. According to the guide, she signed the partnership arrangement on March 15. The one she had obviously not read thoroughly enough. The one that allowed me considerable influence over the main financial choices made by the business. Vivian is blowing up my phone as I type this. On social media, Ezekiel's name has vanished. She used business funds to purchase the expensive sofa. Suddenly, the one she was sitting on with such pride in those pictures is up for sale online. I have a meeting tomorrow morning. With the ethics committee, no. She was just rattled by it. If Vivian's previous actions are discovered, the actual meeting will be with someone who stands to lose far more. Once everything is moving forward, I'll provide another update. Right now, I'm seeing her gradually come to terms with the fact that her superior decision might cost her all she has fought so hard to achieve. My largest card hasn't even been used yet. Since things escalated more quickly than anticipated, here are 2 brief updates from the past 24 hours. Do you recall the meeting I mentioned? It was about something far more significant than Vivian's spending reports. 5 years ago, I did more than introduce people when I helped Vivian get her job. I made a sizable investment using a holding company name. She didn't bother to do any research. She was so thrilled about the chance at the time that she hardly paid attention to the paperwork she had just signed. I had to direct her attention to her new corner office in order to notice the specifics. I brought all 3 months' worth of questionable transactions, taped conversations, and receipts to the board meeting this morning. However, I didn't show any of it. Rather, I just put my voting rights as a stockholder on the table. The chairman had a wonderful expression on his face. "You are Morgan Holdings' silent partner." I gave a nod. Additionally, I'm worried about some recent choices made by several executive team members. At that moment, my phone began to buzz. My coworker Olivia, who had been monitoring the situation, texted Ezekiel as she left Vivian's office. He appears angry. She's in tears. It turns out that Ezekiel met with the legal team from his former employer this morning. Some secret information that had inexplicably found its way to their rivals piqued their curiosity. Details that coincided exactly with when he and Vivian had their business meals. I was able to voice my concerns with the company's direction and recommend a comprehensive audit of all executive spending during the 47-minute board meeting. Long enough for Vivian to learn that her soon-to-be ex-husband was her silent partner, who held 12% of the business. The messages began to flood in. Vivian, for what duration have you held shares? Vivian, how come you didn't tell me? Vivian, Hunter, could we please discuss this? Vivian, everything I've worked for will be destroyed by you. To the last one, I responded, no, you were the one who did it. Examine your email. Screenshots of her talks with Ezekiel about private corporate information and the partnership agreement she had signed 5 years prior were included in the email. The one that mentions ethical transgressions in great detail. Then Sophia called. Vivian was just dumped by Ezekiel. Said that she poses too much of a risk. Hunter, she's going crazy. Her credentials were already suspended when she attempted to access the executive accounts. How are the accounts known to you? Since I was the one who recommended the audit to the board, I inquired. Last week. She requested me to hold those documents when I viewed them. Sophia spoke steadily. My sister is someone I adore. However, after what she did to you, she asked me to assist conceal the evidence. My attorney phoned at that point. The board had made up its mind. Vivian was not being fired. That would be too messy and too public. Rather, they were giving her an option. Quit quietly or be subject to a thorough probe on her behavior. Her stock options would be suspended for review in any case. Damien texted me just as I was about to return to the hotel. Look at the security cameras, dude. When I logged in, I saw Vivian in our home office, furiously searching through files. It was the same office where, 3 years prior, I had concealed a safe beneath the artwork of our Bali honeymoon. The safe in which I stored copies of all the papers, investments, and proof that I had contributed to her professional development. She located the safe and tried every possible combination of her birthday, our wedding date, and the day she was promoted. Wrong, wrong, wrong. The mix. She signed the cooperation agreement on that date. The day she won everything that she would soon lose. My phone rang once more. It was the chairman this time. "We must discuss the company's future, Hunter." The security feed caught my attention. For the final time, the luxury couch that Vivian had purchased to impress Ezekiel was already worn, and she was sitting at my desk with her head in her hands. Having given up on the safe, I informed the chairman that I would be there in 20 minutes and that I had some suggestions on the reorganization of the executive team. Vivian will find out tomorrow just how much power I've had all along. Not only her work, but all the choices she believes she made on her own throughout the previous 5 years. The finest aspect? I never had to speak louder. Threatening was never necessary. She simply needed to let her own decisions take over. The final version will be available soon. I have one more card to play. The last update. My last update was 1 month ago. I wanted to hold off on announcing the outcome until everything was done. Do you recall the previous card I mentioned? The company shares and the expense reports weren't the only things at stake. It had to do with something far more strategic. The couch will be our first focus. Vivian purchased that $12,000 designer item to win Ezekiel over. She wasn't just using business funds. She made use of money from a special account that was created especially for a planned merger. Ezekiel was attempting to obtain inside information regarding the same merger. Here's the lovely part, though. I anticipated that she would act in this manner. I learned from 5 years of marriage that Vivian couldn't help but flaunt herself. I therefore began setting the foundation 3 months prior to my trip to Seattle. Every detail about possible deals I discussed over dinner, every informal discussion about the projects my company is working on, all of the carefully crafted information was useless despite its apparent value. Vivian was unaware that the actual projects and agreements were concealed behind non-disclosure agreements, NDAs. The board convened an emergency meeting the morning following my last update. They showed Vivian everything, including the unapproved spending, the information that had been leaked, and the audio recordings of their talks with Ezekiel. But the last blow, Sophia was the source. With a laptop filled with emails between Vivian and Ezekiel about how they would use my insider knowledge to benefit from the merger, my sister-in-law entered the boardroom. Emails from before my trip to Seattle. Sophia spoke steadily, and I kept copies of everything she said. She kept asking me to keep documents, and every time they discussed taking advantage of Hunter's position, I was unable to remain silent. In an attempt to defend herself, Vivian said that Ezekiel had tricked her. Olivia's role came into play then. She provided proof that Ezekiel had been collaborating with our main rival the entire time. Vivian carefully crafted false information that led our rivals down costly dead ends with every bit of valuable information she gave him. The board's decision was unanimous. Vivian was terminated, her stock options voided and her reputation in the industry destroyed. But I wasn't done. Remember that partnership agreement she signed? The one giving me control over major financial decisions. It had another clause. Any ethical violations would trigger an immediate review of all personal assets acquired during the partnership. The house purchased with a loan I'd guaranteed, her car bought through a company lease. I'd arranged even her precious designer wardrobe, mostly bought with company funds. I'd helped her access. By the time my lawyers finished, Vivian was left with exactly what she'd brought into our marriage, her personal savings and a stack of student loans I'd quietly stopped paying. Ezekiel disappeared the moment things went south, but not before my private investigator documented every meeting, every transaction, every lie. He told Vivian about his wealthy family and business empire. Last week, I received a hand-delivered letter from Vivian. Inside was a house key, the same one she'd had made when she changed the locks. There was also a note. "I understand now, you didn't just help build my career. You designed its self-destruct sequence." She was right. Every step up the corporate ladder, every connection she made, every opportunity she grabbed, I'd carefully constructed it all with one purpose. It could all be dismantled. The moment she betrayed my trust, the couch, it was just delivered to my new office. A reminder that sometimes the best revenge isn't about destroying someone's world. It's about letting them destroy it themselves while thinking they're winning. Damien asked me yesterday if it was all worth it, if spending years setting up such an elaborate contingency plan was excessive. I looked around my new corner office, the one that used to be Vivian's, and smiled. The best revenge, I told him, is watching someone realize that their better choice was actually their biggest mistake. Yesterday, I signed the final paperwork. The merger went through the real one, not the decoy. Vivian and Ezekiel tried to exploit. The company's value tripled overnight. Vivian watched it happen from her parents' guest room, where she's been staying since everything fell apart. Her last text to me was simple. "You planned this all along, didn't you?" I didn't answer. Some questions don't need answers. The designer couch sits in my office now, barely used a $12,000 trophy of someone else's hubris. Sometimes the best things in life aren't free. They're just paid for by someone else's mistakes.